Deep beneath the Antarctic ice, scientists drilled into a million-year-old lake and found it utterly sterile. A tomb. But then, a signal appeared. A slow, steady heartbeat from the darkness below. They thought it was a conversation, a chance for first contact, but they were wrong. The data revealed a horrifying truth. It wasn't trying to talk, it was waking up. What do you do when poking the greatest discovery in human history could boil the oceans? The Southern Ocean is a place of brutal truths. It does not care for hope. It does not bargain with ambition. It is a realm of ice and pressure, of winds that can strip paint from steel, and a cold that can fracture bone. And for 47 days, the icebreaker, Kepler, had punched its way through this realm, a tiny bastion of warmth and light in an endless desolation of white. Inside the mess hall, that warmth had curdled into a raucous, boozy celebration. The roughnecks of the drilling crew, men and women carved from the same unforgiving material as the continent they were approaching, roared with laughter, their voices echoing off the steel bulkheads. They were celebrating the end of the journey and the beginning of the work, the two mingling into a single glorious excuse for a party. At a small table in the corner, an island in a sea of revelry, Dr. Elara Vance saw none of it. The noise was a distant hum, a data set she had already filtered out. Before her lay the only truth that mattered, a ruggedized tablet displaying gravimetric readings, and beside it, a stack of printouts showing the ice-penetrating radar scans of their destination. Her fingers traced the faint, ghostly outline of the subglacial lake, a body of water trapped for millions of years beneath 2 miles of solid ice. Anomaly-5, the world's last true unexplored frontier. A tray clattered onto her table, startling her. Maya Shirazi, a geophysicist barely out of her 20s, beamed down at her, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm Elara faintly remembered feeling once. "You have to eat something, Dr. Vance," Maya said, pushing a plate of stew forward. "Big day tomorrow. We'll be making planetfall." Elara offered a tight, dismissive smile. "Planetfall, a bit dramatic, isn't it?" "Is it?" Maya leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Think about it. An ecosystem sealed off from the rest of the world for, what's the latest estimate? 1.5 million years? Anything could be down there. Living fossils, chemotrophs that breathe sulfur and excrete gold. Life, but not as we know it." Elara looked from Maya's shining face back to the cold data on her screen. She remembered a time when she'd allowed herself such flights of fancy. She remembered the project, the charismatic senior colleague, the flawed intuition she had trusted. She remembered the public humiliation when the data proved them catastrophically wrong. Never again. The numbers were her shield. The process was her sanctuary. "We follow the data, Maya," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the younger woman's excitement. "The radar shows a body of liquid water. The core samples suggest a mean temperature of -3 degrees Celsius. The pressure models are stable. That is what we know. Everything else, extrapolating beyond the data, is for science fiction, not science." Maya's smile faltered, and she retreated, leaving Elara alone with her numbers, the only companions she trusted in the vast, unforgiving white. Weeks later, the memory of the ship was a distant dream. The world was now the inside of the Anomaly-5 drill station, a cramped, prefabricated habitat that groaned under the constant assault of the Antarctic winds. The air tasted of ozone and machine oil, and the world was a cacophony of industrial noise. The deep, grinding groan of the thermal drill head, the whine of generators, the hiss of hydraulics. In the command hub, the tension was a physical presence. Elara, Maya, and the chief engineer, Ben Carter, stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on a central monitor. Ben, a man who looked as weathered and reliable as the machinery he commanded, had a philosophical calm about him. He had seen it all, and the ice had taught him patience. The screen displayed a simple line graph: drill torque and resistance. For weeks, it had been a jagged, angry scribble as the drill chewed through rock and ice. But now it was smoothing out. 2 miles down, the laser-sharp drill head was approaching the final barrier. Elara held her breath, her hand unconsciously tightening into a fist. This was it. The culmination of a decade of planning, of billions of dollars, of her entire career. The line on the graph, the one indicating resistance, suddenly and completely flatlined. It dropped from thousands of pounds per square inch to 0. A collective gasp went through the room. "Punch through," Ben said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of the moment, the quiet reverence of a man witnessing history. Elara stared at the flat line, the perfect, beautiful 0, and for the first time in years, a rare, genuine smile broke across her face. The process had worked. The data had been right. They were in. The biolab at Anomaly-5 was the cleanest place on the continent, a temple of sterility and chrome. Inside a hermetically sealed chamber, robotic arms, extensions of Elara's own methodical will, manipulated a sample of the lake water. It was the first water drawn from Lake Hyperion, the name they had given their discovery. It was crystal clear, pristine, untainted by the surface world for over a millennium. Elara and Maya stood before a bank of monitors, watching as a dozen automated tests ran their course. Extremophile analysis, genome sequencing, cellular microscopy, carbon dating. They waited for the screens to populate, for the discovery of a lifetime to reveal itself. The first results came in. Extremophile analysis, negative. Then the next. Trace DNA scan, negative. Microbial culture growth, negative. One by one, the screens flashed their verdicts, each a nail in the coffin of their hopes. There was nothing, no bacteria, no archaea, no viruses, not even the stray organic molecules they would expect to find in the most sterile environments on Earth. It was water and nothing more. The final test completed. Carbon dating. The number that appeared on the screen was so staggering it seemed like an error. The water hadn't been exposed to the atmosphere for 1.5 million years. It was a perfect time capsule, exquisitely preserved, and it was utterly, completely lifeless. "It's a tomb," Maya whispered, her voice cracking with devastation. The lab door hissed open. Director Marcus Thorne strode in, his expensive parka looking absurdly out of place against the lab coats. He was a man who radiated ambition, who saw science not as a process of discovery, but as a path to prestige. He looked at the bank of negative results, his jaw tightening. He looked at the impossible age of the water, his face, which had been primed for a triumphant press conference, darkened into a mask of pure fury. "A multi-billion-dollar sterile bottle of water," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. He looked directly at Elara, his eyes cold. "This is a failure." Night fell on the station, but in Antarctica, night is just a different shade of blue, a deeper cold. The mood inside Anomaly-5 was funereal. The project was over. Thorne was already making arrangements to pull out, to bury the colossal failure as quietly as possible. In a small dark tent set away from the main station, Elara was performing the last rites. The tent housed the secondary sensor arrays, a collection of humming electronics that monitored the deep core environment. It was dimly lit by the orange and green glow of their screens. She was methodically archiving the project's failed data, creating a neat, orderly digital graveyard for her hopes. She was tired, a deep, soul-crushing weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. She initiated the shutdown sequence for the deep core thermograph sensors, watching the data streams flatline one by one. Her final task was to shut down the seismograph, a sensitive instrument Ben had left running on a deep scan frequency, just in case. As her cursor hovered over the shutdown command, a single, tiny alert flashed in the corner of the monitor. A new event. She paused, frowning. She opened the event file, and her breath caught in her throat. On the screen, a waveform was drawing itself. It wasn't the chaotic, jagged signature of an icequake or the low rumble of shifting bedrock. It was a perfect, rhythmic, low-frequency pulse. It rose to a clean peak, fell to a clean trough, and then went quiet. Then, exactly 82 seconds later, it did it again, and again. A slow, steady, metronomic beat. It looked less like a geological event and more like an electrocardiogram. It was the beat of a massive, impossibly slow heart, pulsing from somewhere deep beneath the sterile, million-year-old waters of the tomb they had just opened. The main lab at Anomaly-5, which hours before had been a chamber of disappointment, was now electric with a new, uncertain energy. Elara stood before a large monitor, the perfect, rhythmic waveform of the signal looping over and over. It beat like a silent drum, a question mark drawn in light. Director Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of impatient skepticism. Ben Carter leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "It's been constant for 12 hours, Elara began, her voice steady and professional. A repeating low-frequency pulse every 82 seconds. The origin is deep, approximately 3,000 feet below the lake bed." Thorne let out an exasperated sigh. "Vance, it's an echo, a harmonic from the drill shaft resonating in a geological pocket. It's noise. Find it, identify it, and filter it out. The last thing I need is to report a ghost in the machine to the National Science Foundation. Our billion-dollar failure is embarrassing enough without adding phantom heartbeats to the mix." "It's not a harmonic," Elara countered calmly, pulling up another window showing a spectral analysis. "The frequency morphology is all wrong. It's too clean, too consistent. There's no mechanical signature, no decay, no distortion you'd expect from a simple echo. I've cross-referenced it with every known geological event. It matches nothing." Ben, who had been silent, finally spoke, his eyes still glued to the waveform. "It doesn't feel like machinery," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was an uncharacteristically unscientific observation from a man who spent his life governed by the laws of physics and mechanics. It was an admission of intuition, and it hung in the air between them. Thorne scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Feel? We don't operate on feel, Ben. We operate on facts. Dr. Vance, find me a rational, mechanical explanation. I don't care what it is, just make it boring and terrestrial. Am I clear?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning and striding out of the lab, leaving Elara with an impossible task: to find a rational explanation for something that felt profoundly irrational. Following Thorne's orders, Ben and Maya descended into the guts of the station. They were in the drill head maintenance shaft, a cramped, freezing cathedral of steel directly above the 2-mile-deep borehole. The air hummed with latent power, and the cold was so intense it felt sharp, biting at any exposed skin. Their task was to hunt for the source of Thorne's imaginary harmonic. "If there's a resonance coming off this shaft, it would have to be a microfracture in the drive assembly," Ben grumbled, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "But this thing is rated to withstand pressures that could turn a tank into a tin can." He handed Maya a magnetic sensor. "Place these every 5 meters, all the way down to the pressure seal." Maya nodded, clipping her harness onto a safety line. As she began to work her way down the massive, silent drill assembly, she started to hum a tune under her breath, a simple, repetitive melody to combat the cold and the unnerving quiet. She placed the first sensor, its magnetic base clanking loudly against the steel. As she hummed the next bar of her song, the overhead strip lights in the shaft flickered. Once, twice, in perfect time with her humming. She stopped, her hand hovering over the spot for the next sensor. The lights stayed steady. She looked up at Ben, who was watching her from the platform above, his face puzzled. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice small in the vast space. Ben nodded slowly. He walked over to a power conduit, prying open the inspection panel with a grunt. He scanned the diagnostics. Power flow is perfect. No fluctuations, no shorts. He looked back down at Maya, then at the lights, a deep, unsettling feeling creeping into the edges of his pragmatic worldview. A superstitious man would call it a haunting. A conspiracy theorist would call it a signal. But Ben Carter, an engineer who knew every wire and every circuit in this station like the back of his own hand, had no name for it. And that was what truly terrified him. 36 hours. For 36 hours, Elara had not slept. Her workstation in the main lab had become a chaotic nest of data windows, spectral analysis charts, and discarded coffee cups. She had pursued every rational explanation to its logical, bitter end. She ran the simulations. Geothermal activity, the signal lacked the chaotic tremor of venting gases. Ice shelf resonance, the frequency was too stable, too low. Drill harmonics? She and Ben had modeled every possible vibration from the machinery, and none came close. Solar interference? The magnetosphere was quiet. She even, in a moment of near desperation, scanned maritime logs for a Russian submarine that might have passed 1,000 miles away, its sonar bouncing off the continental shelf in some bizarre, attenuated pattern. Nothing. The signal remained. Clean, persistent, undeniable. And its origin was a pinpoint, a single unmoving source deep in the bedrock beneath the sterile lake. The lab door hissed open, and Thorne entered, his face etched with impatience. "Report." Elara rubbed her bloodshot eyes. "I've ruled out every known mechanical, geological, and atmospheric source." "So you have nothing," Thorne snapped. "I have a conclusion," she replied, her voice gaining a sharp edge of defiance. "The signal is a genuine anomaly. It cannot be explained by our current models." Thorne stared at her, a strange glint in his eye. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked inspired. "Good," he said. "Give me the report." "I just did," Elara said, confused. "It's an unknown." "No," Thorne said, leaning over her desk. "It's a novel geothermal phenomenon, a previously undocumented form of magmatic resonance, trapped and amplified by the unique geological strata of the region. A discovery, something I can use." Elara stared at him, horrified. "You can't do that. We can't assign a cause without evidence. That's not science." "It's funding, Dr. Vance," he snarled, his voice dropping. "It's turning this catastrophic failure into a career-defining success. Write the report. Emphasize the unique energy potential. I want it on my desk by morning." He walked out, leaving Elara in the ruins of her workstation, the integrity of her life's work violated by the one thing she thought was immune to corruption. The ambition of men. She had to get out. The recycled air of the station felt suffocating, thick with lies and paranoia. She pulled on her heaviest parka, stepping out into the brutal, cleansing cold of the Antarctic evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the sky was still lit with an ethereal, violet glow, the magic hour. The world was a panorama of impossible color over an endless, silent sea of white. She walked away from the station's lights, the crunch of her boots on the hard-packed snow the only sound. In her gloved hand, she held a sensitive audio recorder connected to a geophone, its spike pushed deep into the ice. She put on a pair of headphones, insulating her from the whisper of the wind, and turned the gain all the way up. She was listening to a direct translated feed of the signal. It wasn't the sharp, clinical ping she saw on the monitor. It was a sound that was felt as much as it was heard. A deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate up from the core of the planet, through the soles of her boots and into her very bones. It was a sound of immense scale and immeasurable age. It pulsed with a slow, mournful rhythm, a bass note so profound it seemed to hold the loneliness of 1,000,000 years. It didn't sound like geology. It sounded organic. It sounded alive, and as she stood there, a lone figure under a violet sky, Elara Vance felt the rigid certainty of her scientific world begin to fracture. The lie, once spoken, took on a life of its own. Thorne's novel geothermal phenomenon was no longer a desperate fabrication. It was an official mission directive. He had secured a stay of decommissioning from the NSF, promising them groundbreaking data on a new form of planetary energy. and his method for gathering that data was now being assembled in the center of the main lab. A subglacial sonar emitter, a powerful, brutish instrument designed to map rock and sediment. Elara stood before him, her face a mask of cold fury. Ben and Maya stood behind Thorne, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and reluctant obedience. "You can't do this, Marcus," Elara said, her voice low and tight. "We have an unclassified signal of unknown origin, and your first instinct is to bombard it with a high-intensity active sonar. That is reckless, not scientific." Thorne barely looked up from the emitter's control interface. "It is decisive. We have a source of energy down there, and I intend to map its boundaries. This is standard geological survey procedure." "This is anything but standard," she shot back, her voice rising. "The signal is responsive. The power fluctuations Ben and Maya witnessed. It's reacting to us in ways we don't understand. Blasting it with sonar is like finding a strange, sleeping animal in a dark cave and deciding to poke it with a cattle prod. It's like screaming at something you don't understand, just to see what it does." "I am done with your unsubstantiated fears, Doctor," Thorne said, finally turning to face her. "Your job is to provide analysis, not to obstruct. You've had your chance to identify the signal, and you failed. Now I will get the answers myself." He turned to Ben, his voice returning to a commanding boom. "Mr. Carter, begin the power-up sequence." Ben hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the console. He glanced at Elara, his eyes filled with a silent apology. But the order had been given. With a heavy sigh, he engaged the primary switch. The machinery around them began to hum with a deep, predatory thrum. Thorne smiled, a thin, triumphant smirk. He was in control. The low hum of the sonar emitter filled the lab, a rising drone that vibrated through the floor plates. On the main screen, a 3D grid representing the space beneath the lake appeared. It was an empty black cube, waiting to be filled with information. Ben, his face grim, initiated the firing sequence, a series of timed pulses, each one a powerful burst of sound that would travel down the 2-mile borehole and paint a picture of the world below. "Firing first pulse in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, he announced, his voice flat. He pressed the key. A sharp electronic ping echoed through the lab. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, on the monitor displaying the anomalous signal, the rhythmic, heartbeat-like waveform vanished. The line went completely, perfectly flat. The deep, resonant thrum that had become the station's ever-present background noise was gone. The silence was deafening. It was more profound and unnerving than the signal itself. Maya let out a shaky breath of relief. Maybe we scared it off. Or disrupted the pocket it was in. Thorne's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. He clapped his hands together. "See? Just as I said. A geological pocket reacting to the pressure changes from the drill. The sonar pulse was enough to collapse it. Problem solved." He looked at Elara, his eyes gleaming with condescending victory. "It seems your sleeping animal was just a bit of gas." But Elara wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the flatline monitor. Her face was pale with a dread so pure it was almost crystalline. The absence of data wasn't a solution. It was a response. The silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence of something listening. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible over the hum of the machinery. "It's listening." As the word left her lips, the world ended. The needle on the seismograph, which had been perfectly still, slammed so violently against its limiter that the entire machine shuddered. A sound erupted from the lab's speakers, a deafening, mind-shattering wave of noise that wasn't a reply, but a counterattack. It was the exact sonar ping they had just sent, but amplified 1,000 times, layered with a horrifying cacophony of clicks, deep thrums, and screeching resonant frequencies. It was their own voice, twisted into a declaration of war. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, and then exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the lab into the terrifying bloody glow of the emergency red lighting. Alarms blared, a frantic, shrieking pulse that was completely drowned out by the entity's reply. The entire station shook, not with the gentle rhythm of the old signal, but with a violent, chaotic shudder that threatened to tear the structure apart. On the main screen, the 3D map, which had been a black, empty cube, was resolving at an impossible speed. The sonar returns were painting their picture. But it wasn't a picture of rock formations or sediment layers. It was a vast, intricate, web-like structure. A lattice of impossible geometry and terrifying scale, glowing a faint, sickly orange in the darkness of the lab. It spread for miles beneath the lakebed, a symmetrical, complex pattern that could not be geology. It was biology. It was technology. It was something on a planetary scale, and they had just screamed in its face. The monster was real, and science had just given them the photograph to prove it. The station was on lockdown. The deafening reply had faded, replaced by an even more terrifying silence and the frantic, useless blare of the emergency alarms. In Thorne's office, the only light came from a single monitor displaying the frozen, terrifying image of the massive structure beneath the ice. Thorne was a changed man. The arrogant, dismissive executive was gone. In his place was a figure of manic, electrified energy. His eyes were wide, his breathing was rapid. He wasn't scared, he was ecstatic. "This isn't a discovery," he whispered, his voice trembling with a zealot's fervor. He stared at the image on the screen. "This is first contact. This is history. This is everything." Elara and Ben stood before his desk, both still in a state of shock. "Marcus, you have to report this," Elara pleaded, her voice hoarse. "We need to evacuate. We have provoked something we cannot possibly comprehend." "Report it!" Thorne laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "Of course I'll report it, but on my terms." He stabbed a finger at a button on his desk console. "As of this moment, all external communication from this station is severed. All data is classified at the highest possible level." He turned his wild eyes to Elara. "And your top-level clearance is hereby revoked." Elara stared at him aghast. "What? You can't do that. I'm the lead scientist." "You're a liability," he shot back, his voice crackling with newfound power. "You see caution and fear. I see the single greatest moment in human history, and I will not have it jeopardized by your scientific timidity. We have no idea what it is or what it wants," she yelled, taking a step forward before Ben put a restraining hand on her arm. "We need to stop. We need to observe. We need to be silent and listen." Thorne ignored her completely. His gaze was locked on the glowing image, a look of pure adoration on his face. "Your job was to find something, Vance. You did. Congratulations. Now my job is to control the narrative." He finally looked at her, his eyes cold and empty of all reason. "You're off the project. Confine yourself to your quarters until further notice." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his attention already back on the screen, the prophet communing with his newfound god. Confined. It was a word Elara had only ever associated with datasets, a term for a controlled variable in an experiment. Now it was her reality. Her world had shrunk to a 10 by 10 foot bunkroom, a sterile box of metal and plastic. The door was locked from the outside. Her tablet, her link to the data, was gone. She was a scientist without her tools, a mind without its senses. But she was not alone. The signal, the entity's reply, was her constant companion. It was no longer a distant, rhythmic pulse. It was a physical presence, a low, incessant, gut-vibrating thrum that permeated the very structure of the station. It was the background radiation of their new reality, a constant reminder of the titanic, unknown thing that lay sleeping and stirring beneath their feet. Through the small porthole in her door, she could see the corridor. It was no longer patrolled by the station's regular crew. Now, men in black tactical gear with no identifying insignia walked the halls. Mercenaries, Thorne's private army, brought along under the guise of polar bear security. She'd thought it was absurd at the time. Now she saw it for what it was: contingency planning. Thorne had been prepared for a discovery he would have to seize, to own, to defend. Elara Vance, the ultimate rationalist, the woman who lived by the creed of observable evidence, was now a prisoner in a polar fortress, besieged by a monster from a million-year-old nightmare. Her jailer, a man driven by a messianic delusion. She was trapped in a situation spiraling into pure irrationality, and for the first time in her life, she had no data to make sense of it. After 2 days, they let her out of her room, but not her prison. She was allowed access to the mess hall, always under the watchful eye of one of Thorne's guards. The atmosphere in the station had changed. The initial shock had curdled into a thick, pervasive paranoia. People spoke in whispers, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. The constant, low thrum of the entity was getting to them, fraying their nerves, seeding their dreams with impossible geometries and the crushing weight of the ice. Elara sat alone, pushing a tasteless protein paste around her plate. At a nearby table, she overheard one of the roughnecks, a big man named Griggs, complaining to his friend. "It's the fillings in my teeth," he said, his voice shaky. "They vibrate, and I hear clicking, like a damn Geiger counter in my skull. It only stops when I'm in the machine shop." A tray was set down opposite her. It was Maya, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes. She sat down, avoiding Elara's gaze, and began to eat. Under the table, out of sight of the guard standing by the door, Maya's hand slid across and pressed a small, cold object into Elara's palm, a data stick. "He's trying to talk to it," Maya whispered, her lips barely moving. She was terrified. "He's building a high-gain transmitter, something powerful enough to punch a signal all the way through the ice and into the bedrock." Her eyes finally met Elara's, and they were wide with fear. "Ben's being forced to help. He said Thorne is completely unhinged. He keeps talking about his dialogue with the entity." Maya took a shaky breath. "It's getting worse, Elara. The signal isn't regular anymore. It's becoming erratic, spiking. And the deep core thermograph sensors are still active. The ice temperatures around the borehole, they're rising." She stood up abruptly, leaving her half-eaten meal. "Be careful," she whispered, and walked away, leaving Elara with the cold weight of the data stick in her hand, and an even colder weight of dread in her stomach. The engineering workshop was the one place on the station where the entity's thrum was masked by the familiar hum of lathes and diagnostic equipment. It was a sanctuary of mechanics, of gears and oil, and understandable things. Elara slipped in through a rear maintenance hatch, the data stick clutched in her hand. Ben Carter was waiting for her, standing by a heavy workbench. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 days. He was hollowed out, defeated. "He's going to send it a patterned signal," Ben said, his voice a dry rasp. There was no preamble, no greeting, just the grim facts. A greeting based on prime numbers. 2 pulses, then 3, then 5, then 7. He thinks he's Ellie Arroway in contact. He thinks he's making the most important phone call in human history. "He's going to get us all killed," Elara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. She slotted Maya's data stick into the workshop's main diagnostic console. The files were encrypted, but Maya had included the key. Elara's fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind, starved for data, latching onto the numbers and waveforms with ferocious intensity. She pulled up the new signal patterns, the erratic spikes Maya had described. Then she cross-referenced them with the thermograph readings. A new simulation began to run, a model incorporating the last 48 hours of data. It was a new question, a new hypothesis. Not, what is it saying, but what is it? The simulation resolved. The conclusion that spooled out onto the screen was so simple, so biological, and so utterly horrifying that Elara felt the air leave her lungs. The entity wasn't a complex network. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a distributed consciousness. The model was unequivocal. It was a single, colossal, dormant organism. Its rhythmic signal hadn't been a communication. It had been a biological process. the slow, steady beat of a creature in a state of near-total hibernation. A shiver. The drilling. "We woke it up," Elara whispered, her eyes wide with dawning horror. The sonar was a massive shock to its system, and the rising temperature. That's not a reaction to us. That's its metabolism. It's starting to power up. She ran a final projection, inputting the power specifications for the high-gain transmitter Ben had described. The simulation showed what would happen when that much focused energy hit the awakening organism. The model predicted it wouldn't be perceived as a communication, as a greeting. It would be perceived as a direct physical threat, a final, unforgivable poke. The organism's response would be a defense mechanism, a massive, uncontrolled, biothermal energy release. Ben looked at her, seeing the terror on her face. "Elara, what is it? What does the model say?" Elara turned from the screen to face him, her entire body trembling. This was the third mini-climax, the final, terrible piece of the puzzle falling into place. Here, in the heart of the machine shop, her pure science, her unassailable data, had led her to a conclusion that sounded like a mythic biblical prophecy, waking the sleeping giant. "It's not trying to talk to us, Ben," she said, her voice a bare, trembling whisper. "It's waking up, and if he pokes it with that transmitter, it will boil the entire ice shelf from below." The klaxons were screaming, not the orderly, programmed alarms from before, but a raw, panicked shriek as the entire station's electrical system buckled under an unimaginable strain. The entity below was awake, and it was agitated. The slow, 82-second pulse was gone, replaced by a frantic, chaotic series of thuds that shook the station to its foundations. Every pulse was a body blow, rattling the steel struts and making the lights flicker erratically. It felt like being trapped inside a drum being beaten by a giant. Elara, Ben, and Maya raced through the red-lit corridors. They were no longer scientists. They were saboteurs. Reason had failed. Data had been dismissed. All that was left was brute force. "Thorne's transmitter is pulling directly from the primary power conduit," Ben yelled over the din, his voice hoarse. "If we can create a cascading overload, it should trip the emergency shunt. It'll kill the power to the whole station, but it will also kill the transmitter." A pair of Thorne's armed guards appeared at the far end of the corridor, raising their weapons. Ben pointed to a maintenance ladder. "Go! I'll seal the hatch behind us." They scrambled up the ladder, the vibrations of the station so violent they threatened to shake them loose. This was their desperate final plan, to save the world by breaking their own creation. Elara burst into the main lab, skidding to a halt on the vibrating floor. The room was a tableau of manic insanity. At the center, the high-gain transmitter glowed, an ugly altar of cobbled-together technology. And before it stood Marcus Thorne, his face flushed with triumph, his eyes fixed on a large screen displaying a countdown clock. 58 seconds. His guards moved to intercept her, but Thorne held up a hand, a benevolent smile on his face. He wanted an audience for his apotheosis. "Too late, Doctor," he said, his voice ringing with messianic fervor. Elara held up the ruggedized tablet, displaying the thermal catastrophe simulation, a spiraling red vortex, consuming a map of the Antarctic ice shelf. "This isn't a conversation, Marcus. It's an execution. Ours!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Look at the data. It's a biological organism, and you are threatening it." Thorne laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that was somehow more terrifying than the alarms. "The ravings of a failed, jealous scientist. You can't accept it, can you? That I'm the one who will be remembered. I am the man who spoke to a new world." He gestured to his guards. "Caesar, make her watch." As the guards advanced on her, Elara knew it was over. She had brought logic to a battle of faith, and she had lost. While Elara created the distraction, Ben and Maya had reached the power conduit room, the heart of the station. It was a cramped space filled with the electric hum of transformers and the smell of ozone. In the center of the room was the emergency shunt, a massive breaker switch, its handle as thick as a man's arm. It was a failsafe that had never been used, designed to be thrown only in the event of a catastrophic reactor failure. "Together!" Ben yelled. The countdown in the lab was at 15 seconds. The entire room shook with another violent pulse from the entity. They put their shoulders to the massive lever, grunting with the effort. The switch was frozen with disuse, stiff and unyielding. The metal groaned in protest. "Now!" Ben roared. With a final desperate heave, they threw their entire weight against it. The countdown hit 10 seconds. The lever scraped through its channel. At 09 seconds, it wouldn't budge. At 08, Maya screamed with effort, her muscles straining. Ben put his back into it, a primal roar tearing from his throat. At 07 seconds, a deafening crack echoed through the room as the breaker finally slammed home. Back in the lab, the countdown clock froze at 02 seconds. The lights didn't just flicker, they exploded in a shower of brilliant white sparks. The high-gain transmitter let out a piercing electronic death scream and then fell silent. The entire station was plunged into absolute profound darkness and silence. The alarms were dead, the thrumming was gone, the countdown was stopped. For a single beautiful second, there was peace. Then, from the deep, came one final pulse. It was not a signal. It was a physical shockwave, a titanic exhalation of pressure and force that threw everyone in the lab to the floor. It was a wave of pure, unimaginable power, a final, deafening roar from the deep, and then it was over. On a single, battery-powered monitor, the waveform appeared again. It was slow, rhythmic, the familiar, sleepy 82-second beat. The crisis was over. The organism was going back to sleep. Thorne, on his knees, stared at the dead, silent screen of his transmitter. A completely broken man, his grand conversation with the cosmos reduced to smoke and silence. Weeks later, the world was no longer white, but a dull, functional grey. Elara sat in a debriefing room at McMurdo Station, the main American base in Antarctica. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sipping a cup of hot tea that did nothing to warm the chill in her bones. Across the metal table sat a man in a black parka with no insignia. He was calm, professional, and his eyes were empty. "The official story," the man said, his voice a monotone, "is that a catastrophic, unforeseen geothermal event compromised the structural integrity of the Anomaly-5 station, leading to its total loss. A tragedy." He paused. Director Thorne's testimony has been deemed unreliable. He's been hospitalized for extreme psychological distress. Elara stared into her cup. She said nothing. All data retrieved from the site, what little there was, has been classified under national security protocols, the man continued. There was no signal. There was no anomaly. There was only a geological event. You understand? It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a new truth being written over the old one. Elara looked up, her face numb. She thought of the perfect rhythmic pulse, the violent, terrifying reply, the final earth-shattering roar. She nodded slowly. The man slid a document across the table and placed a pen on top of it. A non-disclosure agreement. Thick, binding, permanent. An order of silence. Elara Vance, the woman who lived for data, for verifiable truth, picked up the pen. Her discovery, the single greatest discovery in human history, was being erased from existence. Science had found a god, but the institutions of man, driven by a fear far greater than any awe, had decided to let it sleep. She signed her name, her personal experience becoming as intangible and unprovable as a prophet's vision, destined to be a secret she would carry alone, forever. This story starts as a classic sci-fi mystery, a strange signal from an impossible place. But it quickly becomes something much more resonant. It's less about the monster under the ice, and more about the ones inside the station. On one hand, you have Dr. Vance, the voice of scientific caution, who understands that the act of observation can have catastrophic consequences. She represents the ideal, to understand, not to conquer. On the other hand, you have Director Thorne. He's not just a simple villain. He embodies a uniquely human flaw, the desperate need to impose a narrative on the unknown, to turn a terrifying anomaly into a triumphant story of first contact with himself at the center. His ambition isn't just for fame. It's a refusal to accept that some things are beyond our control. The story's chilling conclusion, where this monumental truth is simply erased by bureaucracy, is perhaps the most realistic part. It suggests that the greatest barrier to understanding the universe isn't a lack of knowledge, but our own fear and politics. It leaves us with a truly unsettling thought. What truths have already been found and then quietly buried? It makes you wonder, if you discovered a truth so profound and dangerous that it could break the world, is hiding it an act of wisdom or an act of cowardice?